Hello, this is Mark Mitchell. I hope you're having a good day today. We're going to be looking at chapter 9, which is on class and global inequality. In our textbook today, I've got the PowerPoint slides, and of course, you probably are reading along with e-text, and that's a great idea. But today we're going to cover a whole lot of topics, including what you see on this next slide, an introduction to the chapter, and then we'll see more about inequality and its various forms in the United States. And even though our chapter focuses just on the United States, this is a worldwide problem. So inequality, because we live here and may hear about it day in and day out, just remember it's a problem all around the world. Some places might seem to be better than the United States, and there may be other places that seem to be worse. All right, but we want to also look at global inequality. You can see that's also here on our slides after we look at the United States. And then finally, finishing up with U.S. inequality in global context. Our extra articles that help to illustrate some of the points that the author brings forward in the chapter are next. We usually have 3 per chapter, and that's also the case here in chapter 9. Okay, but as we start off the chapter, we get a good dose of Karl Marx and some of his positions. Our book defines a class, and then just as people who are sharing a roughly similar economic position and lifestyle. So that's a good way to look at it. Of course, we have the social class system in the United States, which is obviously based off what our book is brought off about the economic position. All right, Karl Marx, again, is heavily featured in, I think, any sociology book I've ever read, and depending on, the goals of the course, it could be more or less Marx presented. And so we've seen him in several chapters, and that trend continues here, especially due to our subject matter. All right, but Karl Marx really sees the world with 2 types of people: those who are well off, or the capitalist class or bourgeoisie, and then those, for example, who don't have it as well off. They're trying to get to where the capitalist class is, but that's the working class, and certainly most people there are the proletariat. And he just sees history as a struggle from beginning to current days until the end of time, that there's a battle going on between these 2 classes. So some people have the capital and other people want the capital. That's really his division of the world. Max Weber, also one of our pioneers of sociology, looks at this argument that Marx is looking at, but he does it from a standpoint of life chances. And depending on whether you're a member of the capitalist class or working class, your life chances are going to be different. So some people can afford to obtain education, to obtain health care, and some people can't. Well, at this time, people were wondering, why is it like that? Why can't people be equal? And of course, we're doing that still today. And I think history might show lots of other conflicts that are really no different than what we see with Karl Marx and Max Weber. Now, the inequality that Weber was looking at when he described the life chances, you can see here on our slide, it's between class, it's between social status, and then political power. All right, but we need to understand this next slide, but the question is class stratification functional? Is there a social stratification system for people worldwide? And the answer to that is yes. So no matter where we go in the world, no matter at what time in the world we want to look at it, what this is indicating is that stratification has been used. It's been used to rank people from the top to the middle to the bottom in order that resources and things that are valuable can be divided, where some groups get more and some groups get less. But that's always been the case on planet Earth. So Davis and Moore are saying, well, there must be a reason for this. It must be somehow functional. It must have a goal or purpose if that's the case of the world. And so it's always a matter of, who should get what amount, whatever material resource it is, and is that fair? All right, so when we're looking at class inequality, maybe stratification systems, we would do well to remember these principles or something like it. Is the unequal distribution has always occurred. Distinctive groups making up various strata in society, and they all have different names. So if we go to different cultures, we wouldn't expect the same system, but maybe a variation on it. We've talked a little bit about class systems, about caste systems, so those are good examples. It's not really important to remember all those different name classifications, but just remember that pyramid hierarchy where you have those on top, the middle, and the bottom. And then you have some sort of belief system that makes it fair. That's the key point. These systems of inequality are deemed as fair, and that justifies why some get more and others get less. All right, as we move on here, we simply are looking a little bit closer at the different classes in the United States. And so this can vary depending on which textbook you pick up, but our book does it, I think, a little bit differently than what I've seen. Usually the other books, it's like our next slide, but at any rate, I don't think there's anything wrong with what our book has. All right, but part of the major classes are those on top would be those with the most wealth and income, the capitalist class. Our next slide does a maybe better job of showing you a snapshot of all of them. But the top 1%, you may have remembered that term being used some years ago from the Occupy movement, but they were talking about the 1%, and what they meant was the wealthiest people who had the most wealth and assets. And then you have the middle class. Depending on how many divisions, you can also add an upper middle class. This is usually how the books will have it. The middle class, and you can see 45% of the American population falls here. And then the lower middle class, if you wanted to do that, you just make a few more distinctions about income and wealth and occupational status, and that's how you would identify these classes. Your working class is another 45%, and then the working poor and the underclass drags up the bottom. Now, our droplet, that's what I think this overall figure looks like to me, is a droplet of some type. But at any rate, it's just showing how the standard of living in the United States seems to be going down. You notice how small it is up here and then how large the drop is going downward. And that's not a good thing. So hopefully in the future, that drop will get a little bit less fat in the middle and for working class. But that would indicate maybe good things overall for the economy and lots of people. All right, so the rest of the classes on this slide, the middle class, and for a country to do well, they need to have a nice middle class, and in other words, that people who are in that income level, they can afford things and they're not struggling financially. That's good for a nation overall. The working class, and then finally the underclass are the last two that we looked at. Our next slide just gives you a further description with some details. If you want to stop the recording here, you can look at this for a minute until you're ready to go on. But you can see here lots of descriptions under these classifications in terms of what type of occupation would somebody have, what type of education level do they have, and then something about their income and wealth. When we talk about class inequality in the United States, there are some barriers, some individually and then some that are systematic. Our book mentions that in terms of structural, meaning there's something larger than an individual's effort or ability that's affecting him or her or in a large group of people. So think of the Great Depression when the unemployment rate was 33% compared to what it is today at around 4 to 5%. Was that just that all those people were, terrible and couldn't hold a job? No, there were bigger factors at play as to why so many people were unemployed. Individual mobility does not take into account the structural changes that may affect people and how they're able to obtain a job or a career. Individual there just shows factors or changes that may occur in a person's life that affect whether or not their social class rises or falls. So say if you got sick, for example, and couldn't work, that would be a good example of individual mobility. We've already seen in some stratification systems there is class mobility where you can move up or down, and then depending on the system, there's others where that's not possible. Our book's next slide just shows, for example, the distribution of U.S. household income and wealth, but it's by this quintiles, the different color bars broken up there into 5 parts. But the point our book is really trying to make is, again, the inequality in distribution. There are some classes that really do well, and then there are others that don't do well at all. So, why is it like that way, and how can we resolve that to where it's more equal? That's really one of the things our book investigates. Again, we're looking at another chart, but it's really the same thing from a different perspective. You can see those at the top are doing better than those in all the other groups. And there are some groups that just seem never to do any better, not even by just a little bit. Here, our book shows us a slide there with jobs in the future and where some of those jobs might be. And you can see from the last column about the median annual wage, some of these pay well and some of these do not. So it is another factor you can see in these slides is the fact that they're all service type jobs. There's not a lot there of manufacturing type jobs, but provide some type of service, no matter what kind of service it may be, seems to be those jobs of the future, and those typically pay a little bit less, depending on, there are some variables that would influence that. Here we look at, again, just the distribution of income, this time by family. And looking at on the left-hand side, you see parents' income, and then how do children of those parents, how their income matches up to their parents. And you can see, for example, that parents' family income does influence child's family income quite a bit. All right, so why have we been talking about this? Why does it matter so much? Is, there's something else we could be discussing. Why do we have a chapter on this stuff? But our book makes a significant point in that class inequality is important. It's worthy of discussion because it affects everyone. So these are some of the factors that we can see that class inequality does influence in terms of your own personal health, whether or not what level of education you have, your work, your politics, and your lifestyle. All right, but a couple terms there with this slide: conspicuous consumption. And so that is people who obviously are at the upper end of whatever social class system we have in the United States, but they have extra money to spend that really demonstrates their wealth. So our book does have a picture of the Biltmore estate in North Carolina, which is the largest home, but that was at one time the home of a family in North Carolina, but just a very maybe good thing to relate to conspicuous consumption. Classism there, we've seen discrimination before, but this time maybe it is based on this inequality by social class, which of course is related to income that Marx and Weber mentioned earlier in the chapter. Another interesting graph in our chapter, we have just a bunch of them this time, but figure 9.4 just simply shows that two things being related, and that's college being attended by students and then their income. So not only is attendance influenced by parents' income, but also the quality of institutions that students are enrolled in. So that's a very interesting chart. At least most of it seems to show that. Here just shows that politically, people who they vote more are the people who earn the most, and people who don't earn as much, they typically don't vote as much, or at least according to the data here in our chart from just a few years ago. All right, but in terms of work, your class also affects the experiences that you're likely to have at your employer. Those employees that are working class often have stricter supervision than those employees that are of a higher nature. And then in terms of the compensation, we know those employees that are higher up in the organizational chart earn more than those who are lower. So there's lots of things to look at, but those are two ones that we can look at fairly quickly. We look at poverty in the United States, and it's always puzzled me why there's so much poverty in the United States when we have so much as a nation compared to anybody else in the world through any point in world history. Our book has some PowerPoint slides later that just shows the rate of poverty, and it's just amazing at one point that 20% of Americans were struggling because they couldn't afford the things that they needed for daily life. But here we see two types of poverty. One is absolute, which is life-threatening. You don't have basic necessities, and relative poverty is you don't have maybe things that you want that really aren't life-threatening. Now, how do you conclude the poverty rate? Our book gives us some interesting information on that, but maybe the way that it's concluded is really subject to revision or should be revised, since the standard we have in our book goes back to the 1960s and really says that your food, the money that you spend on a food for a family, should be about 1/3 of your expenditures, and really it's probably 1/5, but that is critical to the way that they figure up, for example, the levels of the poverty line, and then of course other statistics that include the poverty rate. So maybe we're not getting an accurate picture of poverty in the United States based on that. Believe it or not, our chart is very close to being correct. It's just a few years old, but nearly 47 million people are in poverty, and then about 15%, if you want to look at it from that way, are still in poverty today. So poverty used to be higher. Then some social programs in the 60s began, and then poverty decreased. Before that, the elderly were the group of people most likely to be poor, and now a group that suffers the most is the young. But it is interesting that we have not gotten rid of poverty, so that suggests that some amount of poverty is useful. As weird as that sounds, that's why it's happening. Now, mentioned the young and the old, but the group today, another group that really suffers quite a bit from poverty and may not be known to as many people as it should be, but it's women. And that's why we have the term the feminization of poverty. So this is the trend in which women are starting to wind up to be a larger percentage of the poor. And so that's also a very interesting question. And, why is that happening? Here are a couple charts. And again, you can stop the video to look at these a little more if going too fast for you. But we simply just see some descriptors about the poor in the United States that are fairly recent. So it tends to be more white people than any other group, but percentage-wise, we're looking at blacks that are in poverty the most. We seem to see the young suffer from being in poverty, so about 20% there of them, but overall the poverty rate, as we saw before, is about 15%. The families that suffer from poverty the most are single-parent families that are female-headed. And then we see, for example, when it comes to work, most people who are in poverty, they want to work, but they're working less than full-time and sometimes having trouble not working every single week of the year. It seems in terms of where poverty is located, it seems to be very similar in urban and rural areas, but in suburban areas, it seems to drop. The poverty rate seems to drop a little bit. All right, so we have a section here who talks about ideology. That's the belief system that people have, that either they use it to justify inequality or not. And so our book does mention a couple studies there and some points that really kind of look at poverty or are failing to look at it as we should. Hopefully we have equal opportunity, but does that really happen? And then the success that a person has is based on they earned it, their merit, some type of thing like that. They did inherit it. They weren't given a break, but through their hard work and effort, they earned it. And then people finally there in the United States, that those who are successful, they did work for it, they earned it, is what was going on. We've mentioned the idea of equal opportunity before, that all people have the same chance to be successful in whatever they want to do, instead of equality of outcome where you may have to take away from some or penalize some and give to others to put them at the same place. We mentioned a meritocracy, but that is the belief that people can get ahead because of their abilities and their efforts. And individualism is a value that people in the United States have valued for a long time. And so those can tie in to why we have the inequality in the United States and justifying it. Cultural capital on the next slide just talks about, again, for different groups of people, the skill that they may need to get ahead. Same thing with social capital, is that these are relationships that help people maybe better than others. because they're in a group that other people want to be, but they can't get into that. Excuse me. Our next slide talks about culture, structure, and class reproduction. But in terms of schools and their contribution, we see, for example, a few things there. Education pays, and that's simply something we're all aware about, but the longer you're in school is typically connected with higher pay. We are familiar with that. We just talked a little bit about cultural capital, and then schools and ideology. All right, so this slide emphasizes the idea that educational attainment is something that we should strive for because it pays off financially, as you can see from this chart. When we look at, for example, public policy and inequality, we can look at wage and labor laws, and there's a discussion there about the minimum wage. There's also an interesting slide that we're about to see next that talks about paid vacation days and holidays around the world in different nations, and surprisingly, the United States is at the bottom of that. So it's really kind of shocking in terms of time off and paid holidays that workers can take. In terms of taxes, our book mentions two types. Progressive taxation is where the more you make, the more the government takes, and then redistributes ever how they see fit, hopefully to help those who don't have as much. Progressive taxation is a tax that hits those in the lower income brackets more. So things like the lottery or gambling are really, in effect, taxes on the poor. They usually play these things more than what upper socioeconomic classes do, and so that's, I think, fits that definition fairly well. All right, our book mentions there some scenarios in which people who are making just a little bit more than the minimum wage per hour, but yet they really can't seem to live off that, and so that's where public assistance kicks in, that the government is providing citizens with some sort of financial help and need in their life. All right, here's that chart I mentioned earlier about the paid vacation days and holidays of 20 developed countries around the world, and if you look all the way to the right, the United States has 0 paid holidays and 0 paid vacation compared to a lot of these European nations and, of course, a few other places as well. All right, our discussion of inequality in the United States has come to an end, and now we look at it globally. So global inequality. So we're going to look at more nations around the world. We fixing to see another chart that shows purchasing power that really places the United States high up on the list. And so, we're part of those haves that Karl Marx would describe. And, is that fair? Are you going to be willing to give away some of your wealth in order to help others? That would be, one of the solutions that our book calls for. All right, and we can categorize these national economies in different ways. Our book mentions one way here, and then there'll be another slide where they mention a different way to categorize these economies from top to middle to bottom. The slide I was referring to is next up, and so here we see that the United States is number 2 in terms of their purchasing power, what your money in the United States can buy, second only to Norway. So there's some interesting other countries listed here, and as you go to the bottom, Afghanistan, that's been in the news for years and years. There that money would only buy $2,000 or the equivalent of that. So that shows us their nation is on relative the bottom speaking. Who owns most of the wealth? But it's those who are near the top of the social ladder, the social class that is the highest, the most powerful, the richest. They're the one that owns, according to this, almost half of the world's wealth. Again, these things are very important because they affect individual outcomes such as your life expectancy and health, your ability to have housing, and then, of course, whether you're able to go to school or not. We've got a couple theories here, but modernization theory is the idea that these well-developed countries such as the United States, Japan, Australia, and others, they ought to help nations that are struggling and help to bring them into modernity to where it's kind of a win-win situation. Dependency theory is the idea that some countries are kind of made to be weak or held to be weak. They can't develop themselves because that benefits the nations who are in power over them. So those are actually two theories that kind of say the same thing, just a different perspective. Colonialism and neocolonialism is the idea that in the past, when nations would exploit a country, they did it physically. So they would show up with their army and enforce their rules on these different countries or places. Neocolonialism says they still do that, but they just don't do it in a physical way. They do it maybe in a technology way or something like that, where they control a weaker partner, not by physical force, but through their education and technology. So both of them have at their root that other places are being extorted or treated unfairly by another more powerful country. And the idea is that shouldn't happen, that these powerful nations, they should want to help to where these nations that are subservient eventually get to the point where they don't need that help anymore. That would be the, again, a win-win situation. Now, Immanuel Wallerstein is the person who came up with world systems analysis and really divides the world into three types of nations: core nations, periphery, and semi-periphery. Periphery means out on the side. And then semi-periphery is, again, half side. But the idea is that you have nations who are first world nations, second world nations, third world nations. The further down you are, the worse off it is for you. So, I've always read that Africa is a very rich nation. It has a lot of resources, but Africa has not been developed to the point where they can take advantage of that wealth. They just need a lot of help and expertise and actually coming into all or making use of all those natural resources. Our book just seems to mention that the difference between those on top and those on the bottom of the United States has really not been any greater than what we saw about 70 years ago. So what might that mean for the future in terms of what's going to happen for the United States? It's not uncommon to find articles all the time where people, want something done about those who have so much, and what they should be doing with their money and how they should be helping so many who are suffering every day. This graph, again, in a different way, but just shows that those who are on the top, they're doing really well. The top 5%, that's what these graphs are showing, but the lower down you go, things are getting harder and harder for you. So that's, I guess, what Marx would say would finally spark a revolution in people. They're just going to get tired of that suffering, and they have nothing to lose but all the bad things. All right, our chapter ends, and we've got several slides, but these are good to look at and maybe think about some of the things that were in the chapter, or maybe some other ideas that get you interested in maybe doing some of your own research. But you can look at these and see what you think about them. Just kind of good discussion questions to look at. All right, but have you ever been part of a union? That's one of the questions here. How have unions made some good decisions in terms of helping their employees, and maybe some cases where labor unions did not help as much as they thought. All right, but class structure is one of those things that we encounter, and it does influence our life. And you may want to take a moment or two to reflect on how the class structure in the United States has actually affected you or your family. We've come to the end of another chapter, so I hope this has been helpful. If I can do anything to help you, please contact me. Have a good day.